In this video, we'll learn about how to create and call functions. If you've already watched the video about images, you've seen some function calls, but we'll go into more detail in this video. First, let's think about why we would want to create a function. Often when we're programming, we find that we're writing the same code over and over. Perhaps you're volunteering for an organization and need to write a program that will text the same message to all of its stakeholders. So for example, perhaps you would like to invite all of the stakeholders to the annual fundraising and volunteer dinner. As you can see, it's rather tedious to type out the same code over and over, but that's not the most important reason why duplicating code is a bad idea. If I've written the same code in many places in my program and I need to make a change, perhaps because I made a typo or because the organization that I volunteer for wants me to send a different message, I have to make many changes. Now in this particular example, the duplicated code is 3 lines in a row. But that's not always the case. Sometimes the duplicated code might be spread over many files in a very large program. If I need to make a change, therefore I would have to make a change in many places in my program. This means it's more likely that I'll make a mistake in one or more of these places, and it may be hard to find the error later. Rather than duplicating this code, we can create a function that generates the message and then call the function whenever we need one of these messages. A function can take inputs, so the first step in creating this function is looking at my code and figuring out which values can vary. If a value can vary, I want to pass it as input to the function. Here, I see that the name may vary, so I know that I want to pass the name as input. To create a function, I need to use the Python keyword def, then give the function name. Choosing a meaningful function name is important. We want the name to convey what this function does because that will make our code more readable. In this case, I'll choose generate message. Now I need an open paren followed by the list of parameters where each parameter represents an input. In this case, we said we needed one input, which would be the name, so I'll call it name, and then a closed paren followed by a colon. Notice that when I press return, Jupyter indents the next line for me. This is because indentation is important and meaningful in Python. Any code that is indented to here or further to the right is part of this function's body, which is the code that will be executed when this function is called. I can use my examples above to help me figure out what to put in this function's body. So I can see that we say hello, followed by the name, and then you are invited to our annual fundraising and volunteer dinner. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this string to start, and I'm going to paste it into my function's body. I'm going to edit the string, if you remember the plus operator we saw for strings. So I want this to say hello, and then the name, and then you are invited to our annual fundraising and volunteer dinner. So now inside my function body, I've created the right string. Note that if I want there to be a space between the name and you, I have to include a space in the string. Similarly, I have to include the space after the comma. Now what we want our functions to do is to return this message. I'll talk more about what it means to return a value as we talk about calling functions. So here is our first example function that we've created. It's called generate message. It takes one input called name, and it returns the string hello, and then the person's name. You were invited to our annual fundraising and volunteer dinner. If I run this cell, the function will be created, meaning the function exists and we can call it. We have not yet called or used the function though. We will see how to do that in a moment. So as you can see, when we run this cell, our function definition, well, it was executed and we created a new function, we do not see any output. Now let's think about what happens when we call this function. So we have created a new function called generate message. And in order to call that function, we need to use the function's name. And then we look at its parameters. I can see that there's one parameter called name. So if I want to call this function, I need to give this function an input or an argument that will then be assigned to that parameter called name. So if I want to say, hello Juan, you are invited to our annual fundraising and volunteer dinner, I would call generate message Juan. Now let's see what happens when I run this code. So we can see that we called the function, we gave it the input Juan, and what was returned was the string that we expected. Hello Juan, you are invited to our annual fundraising and volunteer dinner. So now let's think about how this function call expression is evaluated. First, the arguments or the inputs to the function, in this case the string Juan, will be evaluated until they are values. In this case, there's no evaluation to do because Juan is already a value, it's a string. But if that was another function call or some other more complex expression, it would be evaluated until it was a value. Now that we've evaluated the arguments until they are values, we assign each value to the parameter as given in the function definition. So what that means is we assign the value Juan to the parameter name in our generate message function definition. Now we evaluate the body of the called function. If a return statement is executed like it is here, evaluate the expression on the right until it's a value, and then return the value. If we're evaluating a function definition that does not have an explicit return statement, the Python special value none is returned instead. In this case, we see that we do have a return statement. So we evaluate the expression on the right to get hello Juan, you are invited to our annual fundraising and volunteer dinner, and then we return that value to where the function call was. Or in this case, our function call expression, generate message Juan, evaluates to the string that we saw as output. That means that we could also choose to assign the return value from a function call to a variable. For example, let me copy and paste here. I could say Juan message, I'll delete this cell. Juan message equals generate message Juan, and then if I want to see the message, I can do it like that by accessing the value that is stored in that variable.